Chapter 1. Autumn, 1843. Isaac Kingston didn't think his Ella would really die. Not actually stop breathing and die. She'd told him she would, but he didn't believe her. At least not soon enough. A person didn't die because her mother wasn't there to stroke her head. If that could happen, he would have died when he was 13. But here he was still breathing while he watched them lower his beautiful Ella down into the ground. Every breath seemed a betrayal of his love. He brought her home. He had to. The Fort Smith doctor who bled Ella advised Isaac to wait for her fever to abate before making the trip back to Louisville. But the doctor didn't understand. He wasn't the one being haunted by the memory of Ella looking him right in the eye the day before the fever hit and telling him she'd die if he didn't take her home. It was Isaac who had to live with that memory seared into his soul. She'd been telling him the same thing every day since they'd left Louisville weeks before, until the words had meant no more than someone mentioning the sun shining or the rain falling outside. Not that he didn't feel bad that she was unhappy. He did. He loved her. So some of the time he tried to kiss away her sadness. Other times he would grab her in his arms and dance her around their tiny boarding house room until she laughed. But there was no laughing once the fever struck, and he began to feel her words might be prophetic. So he'd given up his westward dream, sold his horse and gun to hire a wagon to take her overland to the Mississippi River, and then for the ticket up the river to Louisville. He carried her up the steamboat's gangplank before daylight so nobody would know how sick she was and try to stop him from bringing the fever on board. He had been so sure being on the way home would pull her back from the fever, bring the light back to her eyes. But when he whispered their progress up the river toward Louisville into her ear, her fever-glazed eyes stared at him with no recognition, and it was her mother she called out for. He told her over and over that he was taking her to her mother, patiently at first, and then angrily. She had to understand how he was giving up everything to do what she wanted, but the words, "too late," whispered through his mind and turned his anger into sorrow. She died before they reached the Ohio River. Now the preacher Ella's father had gotten to say the words over her grave was talking about Ella going home to a better place, the home awaiting all who reached for the Lord with faith and sincerity. A chill wind blew across the open hole that was swallowing Ella and ruffled the pages of the worn Bible the old man held. His hands trembled as he smoothed down the tissue-thin page and continued to speak the Bible words without looking down to read them. No doubt he had spoken the same verses over hundreds of newly departed souls. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." The preacher's voice quavered and sounded properly mournful. Why couldn't it have been the old preacher who had walked through death's shadow instead of Ella? Isaac's eyes shifted from the preacher to Ella's ancient grandmother. The old woman had to be pushed in a chair everywhere she went, and now sat huddled in a black shawl, with tears gathering in the deep wrinkles on her cheeks as she stared at the grave of her youngest grandchild. Why couldn't it have been her? Isaac looked down at the coffin. Why couldn't it have been him? It should have been him. This was the second time in his life he'd stood in a graveyard with those thoughts. But everybody told him that was wrong when they buried his father. Nobody told him he was wrong this time. Ella's parents would have gladly pushed him into the grave and covered him over if that would have brought their Ella back to them.